run a lot of these conceptual sessions, and I'm quite excited to get into this today and very open to questions if you guys have, or comments even, that you're welcome to drop into the chat or just interrupt me. Nicola will facilitate all of that. Right, so we are ecosystem AI. I'm not going to get too much into this, but I did want to say, to mirror what Nicola was saying just now, that what we are talking about today is very much something that sets us apart, sort of bringing in and not just understanding the human in the system, but using human behavioral sciences to extract evidence of the human in that system, or in every system, in order to better communicate and understand who our customers and clients are and who the people are that we interact with. I wanted to start with, I know you've got a massive QR code in your face at the moment. If you scan this with your phones, you will get to a SPEND personality quiz. It's a series of questions, and you put in your answers. Try to be as truthful as you can, and then you're welcome to drop the responses in the chat. We'll get to them. There's something very exciting around this surveyed approach to extracting and identifying the customer personalities. If you get a personality in response that you don't know what it is, don't worry, we're going to get them a little bit later on, where I can talk to you a little bit about what each of them are. All right, for the newcomers, maybe just leave this up for a second or two so you guys can scan this, and I'll move on now. All right, I'm going to assume everybody's got it. Before getting too much into the science right behind the messaging, what we want to talk about today, I actually just wanted to have a bit of a spotlight moment into what is digital behavioral analysis. And what is it that we are trying to do? And that is to take digital behaviors, online behaviors, interaction behaviors, app type data behaviors, and understand the meanings of those behaviors are in terms of how repeatable are they, or is it something that is considered to be a unique event or series of events, or something a little bit more, and then to use this information to engage and to find ways in order to communicate better with people.
Yes, if I could just hop in there, just for people who maybe don't understand, because like digital behavioral analysis is one thing, but maybe if you could talk a little bit on the background of what behavioral analysis is more generally and how it kind of looks in the real world.
So I love that. In the real world, in the human to human world, behavioral analysis, it's actually called applied behavioral analysis, and it is a very hands-on practice that was developed around teaching autistic children, funnily enough, how to associate with social environments and how to behave in certain ways within social environments. Most of you know that being on the autistic spectrum means that you sort of lack certain common cultural triggers and hurdles that you would normally navigate. And what applied behavioral analysis does is it teaches and trains how to react to those hurdles and maybe move beyond or move into a direction that is of a particular health or a particular style. Applied behavioral analysis within a digital space can be correlated with what behavioral economics has done in terms of nudge techniques, encouraging people down specific journeys in digital spaces through the suggestion of a next best action or things like that. Now, bringing in the behavioral economics thing here is actually a great point at which we could talk about the fact that we don't necessarily do behavioral economics. It is something that we've tried to move beyond by doing more of the interaction sciences, moving into a space of interaction sciences rather than purely behavioral economics. So what digital behavioral analysis does is it allows you to identify certain clicks or browsing sequences or transactional data, which is where spam personality comes from, in order to understand somebody beyond their demographics. So while we say beyond demographics, we don't necessarily mean that demographics don't play a part in the analysis or the understanding of an individual, but it is just an unreliable analysis on its own. You cannot assume that every 31-year-old female is exactly the same as every other 31-year-old female. There are a number of different facets that go into understanding the entire person alongside their demographics. You've got geolocation data, the ways in which they cluster with people that they are similar to, and the income profiling segments as well. So there are a number of different levels of understanding that we can engage and interact with. What I did want to talk about is, the whole reason we're here, right, which is messaging. So we can ask, why personalized messaging? Why would we want to communicate on a more individual level? I feel like everybody already knows the answer to this, but what I often feel is misunderstood perhaps is that hello name is often referred to as personalization, but it's not. That is something that almost every system out there can do. And it's a very easy system lookup, right? All you need is a list of names correlated in a CRM setting with a list of email addresses, and you just make sure that you can extract that name and plant it into the exact same template you're using to send a message out to everyone. What we are talking about as ecosystem AI, and the reason why we have the profiling base that we do, is that personalization is highly individualized to the point where you have specific structures of a message that are changed in order to appeal to a particular person. So what is the tone that a particular personality type would respond to? What is the timing that individual is most likely to respond within or have some kind of an action within? What is the structure of the message, and what is the channel in which that's passed along? And you'll find that if you can use all of these elements together, you end up with something that is a lot more effective than just a one-size-fits-all approach with a hello name inserted in the top. So ultimately what this means is that every single person within a customer base gets their own message. Now, I know that's quite a bold statement, right? Because you have so many different facets that you can then structure a message on. And so that's how spam personality gives you an opportunity to then craft a minimum of 6 different messages that you would then send to 6 different clusters of people. Now, this is where the system would come more into it. How do you manage something like that? You can use dynamic experimentation to manage who gets what message and what format and in what time. You can use that to understand. So how is this all possible? And that is where the personality construct comes in. The ecosystem AI personality construct is given a structured approach to understanding specific buckets that customers can fall into on a spectrum of personality. So these are the 6 different personalities we have here. They can be broken down into 2 base personalities, which are introversion and extroversion. You can use the 4 outer rim ones, or you can use all 6 of them as you go. These personalities fit within a spectrum. Each individual has a measure of these elements: industrious, experiential, enthusiastic, intentional, introvert, and extrovert. And the combinations of those various levels would then provide a very unique view of that one customer's or user's personality.
And just on that, I think it kind of speaks to that, what you were talking about earlier with kind of going beyond demographics, because demographics kind of work to put people in certain boxes and see them as solidified in those. But because this works on a kind of spectrum basis where you can be on one side or the other, and you can also have a combination of all these different personalities, it kind of speaks to the fact that no human being is just one thing. I find that quite interesting.
Absolutely. It gives you an opportunity to also understand an individual within the various limits of those amounts, right? So you've got this loose bucket that says the customer falls into an experiential extrovert, right? And now experiential has a particular way that you can communicate with a customer, while extrovert has a particular way as well. And if you communicate with them on an extrovert level and they're not as responsive, you can then default to extrovert language. So you get multiple different facets in which you can explore the opportunity to engage with a particular person. Now, to give a light view of who each of these personalities are, like I mentioned, you've got your base, which are your introvert and your extrovert. I'm not going to go too much into that because everybody knows what those are. Within the digital space, it somewhat applies as well. And then what you have on the far intentional side, the far introvert side are your intentional personality types. These tend to be highly deliberate, very targeted, more information-oriented rather than action-oriented. And then you have your far extroverts, which are your experientials. These guys are very action-oriented, very event-oriented, very outgoing, that kind of thing. And then you would have what are called your ambivert personalities, which are those that can fall either on the introverted spectrum or the extroverted. And these are industrious. The industrious I always like to think of as the working mom. So while it's not gender specific, it's very much about that person that prioritizes essential spends, but doesn't deviate too much from discretionary spend. So you'll find that they'll explore a little bit more with their spending, but stick to prioritizing the essentials. And then the other one is your enthusiastic personality type. Now, the enthusiastics are exactly that, enthusiastic about spending. You often find that enthusiastics don't interact with the same category of spend very often. I'll go into categories of spend in a little bit, but you'll see that they'll often have quite a varied and exciting spread of spends. There are a couple of facets that we've used to derive and understand these personality types. One of the facets is human-based psychology, as well as human social sciences, anthropology, and computational social science. And then all of this is extracted and understood through data analysis. Now, of the many human psychological constructs that we used, these two underpin the most important aspects of how we've understood and derived digital personality. One is Jungian typology, which is your breakdown of the individual's ability to draw energy and how they derive energy. This is where you have introversion and extroversion. A large number of psychological constructs are based on introversion and extroversion. And so that made a good base for this. And then another element is the Big Five personality model. Elements of a human as a whole or within a society provide you with a holistic view of a person. Part of the ocean model is openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Neuroticism, by the way, is no longer called neuroticism. They now term it emotional stability or instability. Neuroticism has a negative connotation attached to it. Each person within this core would have a degree of openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. And where you fall on that spectrum collectively will provide you with a view of who you are. Another one that's worth mentioning in terms of the archetypes is the Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs gives you a score based on 4 metrics, and the combination of those would give you an archetype. So some of the archetypes are the healer or the builder or the architect. There's a number of different archetypes that are derived from that. And so that archetypes construct where we've derived an understanding of the buckets of personalities we have. And something that I particularly enjoyed was delving into the human sociological constructs. This is a great way to understand not what defines the human as an individual within a space, but actually what defines the elements of behavior that you can view and understand as not being individual. We looked at two primary social constructs. The first one is functionalism, which talks about how the human is ultimately a functioning member of society. Because they are a functioning member of society, there are certain actions and interactions that will happen and take place purely because they are a functioning member of society. One great example of this is that people are going to shop at supermarkets, right? People need to eat. The other is that people have transport charges. If there is a lack of that, it often indicates that person is not spending within your space on all of their important things, or there's some other very unusual things happening. Perhaps they're in agoraphobe if they've got no transport and that kind of thing. This just gives you a view of what are some indications that this human is in fact just an active human. And then constructivism is a great way to understand how each of these elements fits together beyond just a category of spend or beyond just a food shop. This is what I was talking about earlier with regards to all of the different elements that you can put together. This is where demographics goes hand in hand with spend personality, which goes hand in hand with your geolocation data. It goes hand in hand with a vast number of different digital points that you can use to then understand this human within their space. Now, the anthropological view is based around rituals. The reason rituals are so exciting to look at is that it can be used in two different ways. You can use an understanding of rituals to derive a knowledge of, like I mentioned before with the sociological, to exclude certain behaviors as individualized. Alternatively, you can use it to identify points at which you can engage on a way that you wouldn't normally engage. So let's say, for example, you know for a fact that the introvert base of your customers don't engage in sports activities. You cannot assume that they are not going to interact with a World Cup. So what you would then do is you can then use the understanding of the introvert nature and the introvert messaging in order to send a message about the upcoming sports cup in order to see whether they interact with that or not. Cool. So doing a lot of talking at, and now to the point, right? What does all of this mean? So something important to note is that the spend personality, and if we focus on spend personality for a minute, the spend personality framework that we've constructed in relation to the spend personality module, it is a framework, right? Ultimately, how you get an understanding of each of these personalities is through your company-specific transactional data. So spend personality would come through these categories of spend where you can see how and which categories people are interacting with. And then you can understand the clusters in which those spend personalities begin to present themselves. This is where the module is particularly useful because it's got all of our human social sciences and behavioral understanding embedded within the system. The system uses that information to define what these clusters are and how you can gain a further understanding of these individuals within your data set. Something that is a bonus in terms of the personality types we've created here is that without being in a transactional environment, there are a number of different metrics that can be used to understand them in terms of engagement styles. So this is where we would have more of our engagement personality. And this is just one example of 2 of the 4 metrics that you can use to derive and understand these personalities. The one is habitual behavior, which the system, at least, can understand it through seconds per visits and actions per visits. And the next one is action planning. So this is time per action, so the time that's spent between each action within a visit. This works well within app environments, but it can be used in different spaces. An intentional personality type is highly deliberate. They are likely to enter, perform an action or 2, and then get on their way. They wouldn't spend time wandering around and engaging with that space like an enthusiastic customer would be. To give you a visual view of what this looks like, this is analysis of an intentional personality app visit. So this is where they've got 4 particular steps that were taken, and then you can see the little dancing emoji over there is the action that they took, and that's where it ended. This person went in with a particular reason, they performed that action, they left. On the opposite side to that, we have our enthusiastic customer, which is in one single app visit, gone in and not only stepped through various different parts of the app, but also performed various actions. So you see a high level of engagement, a high level of interaction and activity. Now, what I think is traditionally understood about this is that customer interaction is interaction, right? We want people to be enthusiastic customers, but not necessarily, because your intentional customers still performed an action. They went into that space and did something with that time, and you don't want to exclude that or put them into a place in which they feel uncomfortable where you're trying to get them to do too much. So this is why you can use this information to approach each of these people in a way that's best and most preferable for them. This leads us to this sentimental equilibrium. I'm not going to go too much into this because this is very much Jay's baby, but I did want to talk to finding the right interaction pace. So this is where you can use the spend personality or the engagement personality and our construct of that to define how often you message an introvert or an intentional customer to get them to perform an action, and how often you engage an enthusiastic customer. Based on analysis, you would hold off on too much engagement with an intentional, and you would ramp that engagement up with your enthusiastic, depending on how you want to cultivate that relationship with your customer. So where does the messaging come in? Once you have a view and an understanding of your customer, and you can use that personality base to determine what messages get sent to what people, at what time, and through what channel. So instead of sending this one-size-fits-all to everyone, you would then personalize it with formats and tones, and then you can go further into experimenting with the time and place and the responses in which people are most likely to accept a message or an offer. An example of this would be that you can have a customer, you can have a product, right? You don't necessarily have to tailor your product to personality, but you have a new product, you want to have a campaign for this product, and instead of sending out a message saying, hey, check out my product to absolutely everyone, you would phrase that message in a different way to appeal to each of these people. For an enthusiastic character, you would try to engage them at various different levels. You could send them an SMS, you could send them an app, you could send them an email, and each of it would be in a slightly different format, but always in a tone that's directly for them. For an intentional customer, you would identify which is the platform in which they are the most comfortable and the most engaged in. And you would then send one message that's highly informative to that particular platform, and you would leave it at that. So
yes, if I could just quickly jump in, we've got 2 questions. One from Norbert. It says, is the spend personality model only applicable to financial services, or can it also be used in other industries like FMCG?
FMCG, Norbert, if you could.
Yeah, so Jason, I can maybe jump in.
Yes.
Yeah. So what happens in any kind of fast-moving consumer goods environment, if there is a PLU level detail, you can get basket level understanding of how a person behaves. That means if they shop at a certain retailer and you know they're buying certain kinds of food, you will know if somebody is vegan or not, or you know if somebody consumes dairy products or somebody consumes certain kinds of, category of products. So we have seen it used in that space. The challenge with most FMCG transactions is if you don't have the basket, you can't really use it because it's more abstract. But if you have the detailed transaction of what happens in a business, absolutely you can apply it. The only challenge is you're not going to know if the person, for some personalities like experiential, you normally would track it because a person has bought an airline ticket or they do a lot of shows, their Netflix account and so on. So that means that in that exercise Jess mentioned earlier, there's a method we use to define what a personality is for the kind of business you are in. We have a practice to create a personality type. For any kind of retail or fast-moving retail goods environment, you probably need to create one specifically to that world. We know that in some parts, behavior of people buying running shoes, and let's say you're only an outlet that sells a certain category of product, you're only a clothing versus food versus whatever the item is you're selling, there will be different places where you apply it. If you get access to the customer's transactions, when they apply for loans, if you're a telco and a person gives you their bank statements, you then get them onto your payments app, then immediately it broadens your horizon into the banking and other worlds that give you broad spectrum access. So there are different strategies that can be applied. So the algorithms apply, but not the one Jess spoke about here, because this is done for financial services specifically. Yeah. And then how does the model evaluate the performance of the model? The big thing about the performance metrics, there's a great critique by an analyst saying that most of the psychological conditions that were invented prior to us using data and analytics to figure out why people behave the way they do were done by professors at universities where they were the only ones willing to participate. When Myers-Briggs did his early days research and he created the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the only people who participated in the first stage were students. So that means he had people who were willing to participate and decide how the conditions and how a certain state was described. So for us, being a commercial business and working with commercial companies, the only way we know if something is successful is if the metric has to do with making money, saving money, or protecting money. If the purpose of the message is to get you to engage continuously for customer lifetime value, I first need to figure out what customer lifetime value means, work out an indicator for that, and then measure if interacting with you creates that uplift. If my uplift is at a certain rate, I can then turn the messaging off to see if it goes back to where it was. And that's what we've done with most of our clients. It means that the only way we know we're successful is not because of a psychometric or any kind of psychological measure whatsoever. It is 100% for the purposes of economic output. That means making or saving money, meaning can I get people to perform more efficient activities or not? There's kind of an overlap between the purpose of doing a lot of these things, because the purpose of doing it in the humanities where you are a psychologist, and the purpose of identifying or diagnosing a certain condition is to have a well-defined and predefined remedy. In economics, you work with behavioral economics where all human activity is fairly erratic and irrational. To make sense of the irrationality in the context of your business, if you are a telco, a bank, a retailer, a media company, or a business that sells, rideshare services, or you rent out homes, or whatever it is that you do, you want to understand the psychology of people in the context of your business. So this is not a generic psychological method that gets implemented. This is a method that is turned into an algorithm that is completely automated, that is tied to the metrics of the business and its performance criteria.
That's a perfect segue into talking about metrics like uplift, and also, Jay, thank you very much, talking about, the save money or make money or protect money. I'll get back to that demo just now. I wanted to touch on what we've got here, which is one of the two examples that we can share with you guys, which is, we used our base segmentation of introvert and extrovert to craft personalized messages that increase engagement for saving money. So the purpose was to get people to engage with a savings account. They then open their savings account, they save. It's a relatively low risk activity, right? But there's still a lot of people that don't do it. Now, there was very little engagement with this bank in particular. What we found through this experimentation process was that we ran it in a 3-part experiment, which is to have the introvert message, the extrovert message, and the baseline message, which is what they had already been sending out. During this campaign, we discovered something really interesting. This bank was exceptionally good at speaking to their introverts. And that was their tone. It was the structure of the message. It was the timing in which they sent those messages. It was all very much well received by the introvert customer base. By introducing an extroverted style message sent to an extroverted customer base, they saw a 247% increase in engagement. That's massive, right? And that's just changing one message to appeal to a slightly different collective of people. We definitely have seen uplift, and we use this then in order to re-evaluate and re-understand exactly what personality is within a particular business or space. Like I mentioned in the beginning, this is based on company-specific transactional data. This is to say we got a lot of intentional personalities here as well. To take a step back, I wanted to give people an opportunity. I was going to do a demo, but I don't think there's time for it, and I don't think that is necessary. We'll see if anybody has any questions. But this QR code here will take you to our custom GPT, the smart messaging generator. So if you scan this and click on the launch program functionality, you'll then make use of the prompt engineering framework that we've used to build it. This was built by myself and another excellent prompt engineer to use the ecosystem spend personalities, as well as a couple of other metrics that come from some behavioral economics tactics, which you can then access and understand how to frame a message for a particular personality. Now, there was a question that I was asked a little bit earlier about how does this function with an LLM? Not necessarily, because when you have a banking environment, you've got a lot of hurdles to get through, and you need to make sure that messages are vetted and verified before they go out. What's really nice with the rise of LLMs is that you can use something like our smart messaging custom GPT to frame a particular message for a particular personality type. And you would then take that and rework it. So something that we did as well while constructing these personalities is to define a structure in which you can identify what tone is an introvert most likely to respond to. And so this would be like calmer, quieter, generally asking a question or saying to somebody, now was in the example that we have. Bodhi, I don't know if you actually have that example, but one of the messages was, perform this action, or would you like to do this thing? And the call to action is in your own time. Just something as simple as that for an introverted customer base makes a huge impact, a massive impact. I wanted to also, and I don't know if Eric is here, but talk a little bit to another example use case that we did where we didn't use a personality segmentation, Eric. We used our real-time system and some of behavioral economics, behavioral change techniques. I don't know if you can give us a bit of a view on this.
The idea was to test different messaging constructs. As with other cases Jess was talking about, it was the same thing we were talking about. We were just using a different framing in how we were talking about it. So we tested 5 different constructs and saw a very significantly large impact. Specifically, the reciprocity construct proved the most effective and had a 90% uplift in engagement compared to the approach that the company had been using after kind of years of kind of optimizing their messages. And it also kind of significantly outperformed some of the other behavioral constructs. And I think something that was interesting, which goes against conventional wisdom sometimes and is why it's useful to test these things, is the existing approach and one of the other constructs we tested kind of focused on, have the reward and benefit be upfront, be as kind of snappy as possible, just convey the information. This was a mobile messaging sort of campaign. There's space constraints and all those sorts of things. And that is generally the accepted wisdom that, if you're going to give someone something, put it right at the beginning, don't have too much preamble, make it short and snappy, get the point across, and then you'll get engagement. And that actually wasn't the case here. The reciprocity message did have more context saying, thank you, we want to give something back here. So I think it was an interesting illustration of both the benefit of testing different options and not just accepting what you might think is going to work the best, and also the impact, again, that just framing things in a different way can have. If you haven't seen it, it's always unexpected, the impact that just changing the wording can have. And not changing the wording from something terrible to something good. It's amongst good options. You can still have a big impact by picking the right phrasing.
Yeah, so the reason why I wanted to share this case was because, these behavioral change techniques are quite well known. But when you pair something like this with SPEN personality or ecosystem AI personality construct, it makes a very big difference. You can then have various experiments that fall within the personality construct segments that can really get you to engage and interact with people. Jay, you had your camera on as well. You can see there's a question in the chat.
I was about to type it out. So you don't need cookies to work with us at all because we use real evidence. But Eric was saying you test it because you are working in the system. It's not like you need to store something. And the other part is that you measure the distance that somebody travels through a digital community. That is called the interaction personality. You tie multiple dimensions into one picture. In our dynamic recommender environment or our dynamic interactions engine, there are behavioral algorithms that help you determine where popularity lies or find the items that are not popular. And you want to do those reliable so that you can then interact with the person to keep on testing options, either through an explore exploit like multi-arm bandit or through algorithmic approaches. And then you can use the sentimental equilibrium. Since the beginning of the debate around should cookies be around at all, Google has been trying to stop the use of that. All kinds of ways in which people opt out. But you can't opt out of what you spend money on, how you engage with your environment. If you sign into something, that's what you do. And if you go to any of your San Francisco-based digital companies, Spotify, or you go to any one of those UI environments, all of them track the time it takes you to perform certain actions through systematic desensitization and a number of other means that helps the algorithm to determine who you are and how I'm going to talk to you. So that's what a lot of this is about. It's not about saving the state of what you've done and then retrieving it later. It does help if you do have that, but in most cases, we work on evidence of how they conduct themselves with your business. That's the primary focus.
So that's actually a great segue into what I wanted to do with the test that I gave to everybody earlier, the quiz, the SPEN personality quiz. We often err on the side of caution when it comes to social media data, preferably not using it. Survey data is an interesting thing. I don't know if anybody else has the results of the quiz that they want to put in the chat, or if you want me to put the QR code for the quiz up again, I can do that. If anybody wants to share, Madison, you got intentional, Eric got intentional. Maybe we can just start with those.
Mine changed. I remember the last time I did this, I think I had industrious.
Well, I wanted to just share this with everybody. Practice we did a while ago where we asked people to give us a view of who they thought they were, then volunteered a batch of transactional data in which we ran an analysis on and identified the differences between what people expected themselves to be and what they were predicted to be. And what you found was that, and I just want to share this here, especially considering how many intentionals there are, there were a large number of people, actually almost everybody, that expected themselves to be an introvert. And a vast number of people ended up being an extrovert. This is particularly interesting because of the narrative around the human psychological sciences in which introvert has gained superstar status. Everybody wants to be an introvert. Nobody really wants to be an extrovert anymore because it is considered reckless or risky. It's come under fire recently. I'm an introvert. And what we found was that there were a lot more of these extrovert people. This is a great opportunity to emphasize the fact that what we talk about in terms of the spend personality or the engagement personality is just the digital personality of the individual. So aspiring introvert, Jay, it is not your personality, right? You can be an introvert and spend like an extrovert. So introvert means very many different things, but what people understand introversion to be is that you are quiet and deliberate and you always do things right and you tick things off of a list, and there's all of these idealistic views of it. And so that's why I'm not at all surprised that so many people's results from the test would be an intentional or an introvert. A lot of the questions that lead to an intentional or an introvert is I save and I don't spend on luxury items and I don't spend on discretionary goods. I pay my money and that's it. It's interesting to see the differences between what is surveyed or expected of one and then what one actually does end up spending in. Now, one of the cases for wellness is this can actually be used quite well, is where you can pair the survey approach then with the analysis approach, and you can find ways to then encourage people to get to an expected personality type or a preferred personality type. So where they can then move from an enthusiastic spending style towards an industrious spending style, if that is what they consider to be within a space of wellness.
Great. Yes,
Jay's got a question.
It's an ongoing challenge for people in the humanities to make sense of the broad spectrum of approaches that are competing and in many cases overlapping to find what certain definitions are. And that means that when you do additional research, what happened with the big five over time is that there are as many studies telling you that it's not working as the ones telling you that it is working. In computational social science, you use the behavioral method or the approach that was implemented as an anchor input into finding an implementation mechanism to make it real so that the evidence that you collect is incredibly reliable. So if you think about the Myers-Briggs uses adjectives through a word-based testing system to determine who you are. That means it is entirely your interpretation of who you are. It's entirely your own cognition and what you want the world to know about you. It's like when you do a DISC profile or any one of those profiles, it's your interpretation. The studies done around validating those methods are almost all done in the context of people's opinions about themselves. In a computational social science world, the opinion that you've put in fuel so many times this month, you've bought certain kinds of food so many times this month, whatever it is, not an opinion. It's evidence. So evidential-based methods are quite different, I think, than methods that use more abstract-based approaches. So that means that if we can have a score that's reliable, and if your score changes, we know that there's drift. I've done 2 Myers-Briggs tests historically, and we actually went through quite a big deep dive in one part of my life. We went through deep dives where we did brain profiles, disc profiles, Myers-Briggs, and I got different scores. The one time I was an INTJ and then I was an E. So an introvert, feeler, and a thinker, and then I was an extrovert. And it depends on how you feel that day about how you would answer some of these. In the data world and evidence world, you actually know exactly what data point you're using. So it's far more reliable, even if it doesn't necessarily match the theoretical construct that you're going to work with the whole time, because you're using that as your guidance to help you communicate with a person that has got this digital personality, because that is not what you look like in the physical world necessarily.
Yeah, that's great. Focusing on real behavioral data of how people are interacting with your system is very powerful, and there's obviously lots of weaknesses of just asking people what they think about themselves. The point I was trying to make there is people expecting themselves to achieve a certain result on the ecosystem personality profile, expecting introversion versus extroversion, what they conceive of introversion may be and how that may be different at the kinds of patterns that the ecosystem model is picking up on. If there are differences, and I'm expecting there should be differences, because even the well-known personality models, even for the big five, if you take a proprietary one like the NEO, they define introversion differently than the open source international personality questionnaires. If you go look at the actual items, they're responding to different questions to either get a score of introversion or extroversion. In some personality profiles, I think Jess mentioned people's idea of introverts as sort of ticking the boxes and like doing all your work. Some of that stuff would fit closer to conscientiousness, but then it depends which of the big five instruments you're taking, whether that would be conscientious or introverted or whatever. I would be curious about it. In fact, I was curious enough about the different personality models to actually make notes of how did Jung define introversion? How does the Myers-Briggs define introversion versus extroversion? How does the 16 personality factor define the stuff? How does different versions of the big five model define? All define it differently, and it's interesting. Just the differences conceptually.
I think what does get us into trouble sometimes is that we are using it for purposes other than wanting to fix you. So we're not using it as an instrument to alter your real world behavior other than what the client who's working with it is intending to do with it. So that means that, and we're pretty open and deliberate about it. So if I'm on a wellness program and I want to find a way to categorize people who do a lot of traveling and a lot of outgoing, kind of actions compared to the people who don't, I could have called it A and B, or I could have done a Mintzberg kind of story. This is a good name framework that you can start from because it does fit somewhere within what people believe this to be. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point you're making because I think there are so many competing theories. And at some point, the thing for us is, can you turn it into an algorithm or not, is the ultimate question.
But yeah, I think that also leads me to how I wanted to finish off, maybe do the quiz again. If you guys have done the quiz and think about exactly what the answer is to each of those questions, you might end up being an extrovert or an enthusiastic or somewhere to the other sides. I am definitely an extrovert. I'm an extroverted spender, spending all of this time in this space over here.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who added to the discussion. I think it made it very rich. Join us for our next meetup next week, Wednesday, same place, same time.